beast, we've cornered him. Draw your weapons. Prepare yourselves. Charge!
Welcome to the Raiders Confessional, the podcast for all things raiding in the World of Warcraft.
How's it going, Raiders? This is Ryan, TRC Episode 9, coming at you today with an episode about melee DPS in Tomb. Joining me today are Dan and Cole. Cole is going to be late, but Dan is here. Dan, how are you?
How's it going? Not too bad today.
Cool, man. Well, as always, my name is Ryan, like I said earlier, and I am doing well also. I recently have just gotten back from vacation, but other than me, Dan, what have you been up to in game lately?
I've been covering for your ass. I got to put on the big boy raid leader pants this week, in which it was fun to actually step back into the reins, I will say that. It's been since Nighthold that I haven't really been the main lead point for the guild, and it was something that had to take some getting used to again.
Yeah, it's it can be a bit like herding cats at times. But yeah, it from my end, it makes you pay attention and recognize things a whole lot better than just being another raider. You have to pay attention to a whole hell of a lot more going on in the raid. So, but other than the guild stuff, you've been up to anything else in game?
We capped the DK last week, and now we're actually looking to get gear on it. I unlocked 2 of the empowered weapons, and I think the main goal is to go unholy with it, due to the fact that you started tanking on the DH for a normal run, so...
Right on.
I get to actually get some input here tonight and work with it.
That's cool, man. Well, like I said, we will let Cole come into the call when he gets home. He's out doing some family stuff right now, but he will be here shortly. However, I am excited to say that, the other episodes we've led up to this point, we had our tanking episode, we had our healing episode, and a ranged DPS episode. And, for healing, he had a good buddy of mine who's a Mythic Raider over on the EU side of things. From the ranged DPS, Cole and I had a good buddy we've raided with for a very long time. He's in a Mythic Raid guild that clears Mythic Raids every tier. And then, for the tanking episode, we had Sunny and Ariel from over at the Tankcast. But today, we have Greyhound from the Rogue community. Greyhound is involved in some theory crafting and some other things. But I'm going to let him speak to that. So Greyhound, how are you?
Hi, pretty good. It's a good Saturday.
Yeah, yes, that is true. So hopefully you got enough sleep. We tried to push the date back a little bit. I know you were out having fun last night, so I tried to let you get some sleep in.
Yeah.
But before we get going into the show today, I'd kind of like maybe take a moment to let you speak to kind of what your history with the game is, who you are, what your role in the community, especially the Rogue one, is, what are kind of some things you're involved with, and then your history with the game up to date.
History of the game. I mean, I started playing in vanilla on European servers as a healing priest because Holy was a pretty ook mode. And when Burning Crusade came out, I moved to North America and switched to US servers. And due to entire expansion wars of PTSD from open world PvP, I decided to play a rogue, which is also the last time I had WoW sound on in games. So since I never needed to hear that stealth sound anymore. And I've been playing a rogue as my main from the start of Burning Crusade up until, I would say, Mist of Pandaria. During Mist of Pandaria, I had to kind of main switch to a tank role due to my guild managing to go through 6 tanks in a span of 2 weeks. So at which point me and another officer re-rolled and rogue became more of my ult. And I continued being a tank main up until, I would say, Siege, end of Siege. At the point, I'd raid in multiple guilds on multiple tunes. Like I raided as a DPS, I raided as a tank. When going into WoD, I got kind of burned out with tanking, and not so much burned out, but I just kind of didn't really like some of the changes. So I went back again to maining my rogue, and played a rogue again from start of WoD as my main until like middle of HFC. Which point I went like on a, I want to say like 1 week, not 1 week, 1 or 2 months business trip to Asia at the start of HFC. So when I came back, my guild was already progressing, but one of our previous tanks quit, and the ones that we had at that point was just inadequate. So I briefly went back tanking until we killed Darky, and I went back to playing my rogue. And now I still play my rogue in a different guild now. So play rogue as my currently raid main, and then I have a few ults with tanks, DPS, melee DPS, range DPS overall. Pretty much, I play everything except for healers because healers. I think the last time I played a healer was like in Lich King when I went on my disc and just bubble spammed on Lich King, proc like infinite mana ruptures. That's about as far as my healing goes.
So now you kind of got a history of you and your relation to the game, what you've been up to, what you currently do, but more on terms of like your roles with the rogue community. When you and I have spoken a couple of different times now prior to this recording, I think you had mentioned that you do some theory crafting, you do some Wowhead stuff, you do some relic sims, and then you've also been I think you said you were involved in a couple other podcast with that kind of speak more to the rogue stuff. Is that correct?
I think one of the two of the podcasts were really specific to rogues, just like talking about the class and so on. Some of them were about just gaming in general, I would say, like WoW games. But overall, like in rogue community, I've read the Wowhead guides. I do some theory crafting. I mean, the thing is that like right now, most of the theory crafting in current expansion, it's like setting up simulation craft and just getting it to tell you some numbers. Like, cause it's once you have, like, say you have an idea for a build. Like I was a few weeks ago, I was testing out one of the different sub builds from what people normally run. So what it means is like I have an idea. Like, what if we try this talent combination with this legendaries? Okay, now let's just plug this into simulation craft and see how it works. Let's see, like, oh, like say, like this gets better scaling on some stats. We can, like, can we improve it further and further? And not because again, like I actually do get to chance to raid, and I would say like decent gear. I can also test the builds in game, which is really nice because, like, say, like some of the builds I notice that like, oh, this is simming really well on simulation craft, but when I test it in game, I can see like that it might have one weakness or another weakness to just different things. So that also helps to some extent with theory crafting, that like you can see how like, yeah, it's good on paper, but in real life, like it's not going to work due to like X, Y, or Z.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest discrepancies right now or in terms of what people understand theory crafting to be, is like, I think you said it exactly, where what might work on paper via math formulas very often doesn't necessarily work out as intended in real practice in game. So I think
Nemkin math is the best math.
Right, but I think that's partly why I was very excited to get a hold of you and bring you onto the show. And you made the comment before we hit record today about, you prefer to be somebody who can provide firsthand experience while also, being able to do the so-called theory, the numbers, the formula, what works on paper, because that oftentimes, if you're going to be somebody who's speaking to, a subject, it helps if you can give firsthand knowledge, in my opinion. So now, before we move on real quick, just in the off chance we do have a few rogue-specific players listening today, would you go ahead and maybe name those few of the podcasts that were rogue-specific so that we can link them in the show notes at the end so people can find you there?
The podcast that I was talking about previously was Trading Dummies for Sub-Rogues.
Cool. Well, without further ado, let's kind of jump right into things. And people are here for a reason, so let's give them what they're here for. I guess before we'll stick to our typical format of we kind of give like an overall opinion, an overview of the current raid. So right now, as a melee DPS, what are your thoughts on Tomb? You like it? Don't like it?
Well, I'm biased. Like I say, as a rogue, I can say I like it. If I was any melee DPS, but rogue and warrior, I probably would not like it greatly. So there's a certain bias in that question. And I mean, I feel like the issue is that Blizzard kind of failed on 2 steps of Tomb design. One, they failed with tuning, because this week on Tuesday, we've seen some arms warriors and sub-rogue nerfs going out. And I mean, like, community might cry about them, but I feel like the nerfs were 100% justified. Like, you have 2 classes who are absolutely dominating damage meters for their respective roles. And I feel like the issue is that Blizzard, this is, I want to say, week 4 of Mythic, and Blizzard is responding now, which is probably one of the worst times to respond, because at this point, what I'm seeing a lot is the people who were playing as their like melee DPS, they've gone through Heroic Week, they've gone through Mythic Week, they've gone through Second Mythic Week, they don't see any changes to any of those classes, they don't see any of the buffs to their classes, so what does they do? They reroll. So now, most of the guilds I know have like a bunch of their like rats, windwalkers, demon hunters, even DKs going rogues, getting geared up, and now they get nerfed, which is kind of like a slap in the face, because it's like, you don't do it in time, so you also don't do it when progression is over. Like, I could be semi-justified if like Blizzard decided to nerf classes when the progression was already over, but they decided to nerf classes when, like, I want to say like less than 3 guilds in the world killed it. So that was a bit iffy, in my opinion.
Before we jump to the next point that you wanted to make on that, do you feel that they were trying to get a decent enough sample size, because waiting that first week or 2, you can't really get a sample size out of it due to the fact that it's people learning fights, and you kind of reflect on it 3 weeks into it and it's like, oh, this is what we can do differently to pick up the DPS?
I mean, honestly, like, if it was a small indie game company with a single person running everything, that could be a justifiable excuse. When it's a company of Blizzard size, like that sample size just doesn't fly. Like, I mean, after Heroic Week, when I was talking to like most other tier crafters, everybody was talking about, so how do you think they're gonna nerf arms, sub, affliction, boomkins? Those were the 4 specs that everybody expected to be nerfed after the Heroic Week. Because those were mages or whatever. Mages are expected to be OP. So those are the 4 specs everybody expected to be nerfed, because those were the 4 specs that were drastically overperforming. So right now we already got arms and sub-rogue nerfs, except plate, and I would say not in even the best fashion. And affliction is still getting a free pass. I guess boomkins get a free pass because they're not as brokenly OP on all of the fights as the other 3 specs. But it's like, if you did any rating at any relevant level, you would know after the first rogue weeks that sub-rogues are popping off, and sub-rogues are really strong. Arms warriors are popping up, and arms warriors are also insanely strong, and same as affliction. And I mean, the thing is, people even used this before before raid came out. Like, people had some time to practice with the new things. People had some time to see. People did do testing on PTR, and people were saying that like those specs are doing a lot of damage right now, like way more than you would expect them in terms of like adequate tuning levels. Like, there's a reason why I want to say even during the first week, like some of the top guilds like run like 5-6 rogue comps, like also stacked warriors, and like people who did testings already knew which classes are going to be OP. It's not like after the first week of heroics and the first week of mythics, every top guild figured out like, maybe we should actually drop our rogues because they look to be pretty OP. Like, people went into this tier knowing that like let's even drop boomkins and just say affliction, arms, sub were overpowered. So I feel like that's not really of like, oh, we don't have sample size. That's just a failure to pay attention to this.
Fair enough, I got you. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate, I guess.
No, I mean, like, for sure, like you can for some of the like things you can say that like, well, you might need a bigger sample size, but when you have like some classes, just like it's not like it's not even like it was a small gap. That was like those classes were just dominating in their respective fields, and So I feel like the damage tuning and the timing of the tuning was the first issue going into TOS of melee. Even and that's even ignoring the fact that we have like classes like Red Paladin as a melee who basically rides the bench in every single fight because they're pretty weak right now overall, and their niche I would say right now, which is they actually have really good sustained cleave, and AOE is not really represented in like the which fights do you want to cleave, like which fights can you cleave on? Mistress, you want to maximize single target and avoid cleave so you don't kill the ads too soon. Same thing on host, and that's like so it's like I would say for some melee, like namely Red Paladins, possibly Demon Hunters, the tier was this whole raid tier was just doesn't really synchronize well with their strengths.
And I would agree with that because even in our own guild, we do have a Ret Paladin and Demon Hunter, and our raid roster isn't large enough to really warrant, to bringing in different classes versus others. And, most of our raiders play one main and that's it. We're a little bit, we have 2 bosses left in Mythic or Heroic progression before we jump into Mythic. But I have, especially with our Ret Paladin, he's probably one of the more geared people in our raid. And whereas in Nighthold, we saw him at the top of the meters quite often, he is, a lot of the times in the middle of the pack, and it's not from a lack of experience or skills. It's just, like you said, they're in a very weak state right now. And our Demon Hunter, Cole, who will jump into the call here once he gets home, but he oftentimes has the same complaints of what you're talking about in terms of, it's just this raid right now, unless you're an arms warrior or rogue, from a melee perspective, a lot of these fights are not very conducive to being a melee DPS. So from that standpoint, though, you obviously have your opinions, and I think most of us would agree with you in terms of that kind of discussion. But just from the general enjoyment of the fights and the mechanics and stuff like that, are you enjoying this raid?
I would say it's a 50-50. So another thing again, the issue number 1 was this damage, and this goes into my view of a tier. The issue number 2 are mechanics. Like, say, playing a sub-rogue, playing rogue in general, the way I respond to mechanics is different from, say, like Unholy DK, who just cries and waggles throughout the whole raid instance. So going quickly from boss to boss, like Goros, I would say it's fine for pretty much all melee. Demonic Inquisition is fine, Hargiton is fine, Sisters is fine. Mistress is the first spot where you get really feel like it's kind of different for different classes. Like, say, as a rogue, if you get Hydra shot, even on Mythic difficulty, you can survive with just say you and a tank, because you can just faint. So that mechanic isn't going to kill you. While for some of the other melee, depending on how often you get, it's a bit more iffy. Same with, say, big crashing wave, which sometimes depending on the positioning, you might have some melee dying. Granted, again, you can survive it as any class, but as a rogue, emergency case situation, you cloak it, done. You basically ignore that mechanic. So like I said, Mistress as a rogue, pretty fun fight. Only really upsetting things is when you get a Murloc on you, as you have the fish buff on Mythic, or pretty much the only annoying fight for me on Mistress on Mythic is some mechanics still can make me drop fish. Unless I make personal mistake in a really big one, there's probably most mechanics aren't going to kill me. Going forward, Desolate Host, another fight where as a rogue you just have insane unique advantage that if you stay on top, which is generally where most rogues like to hang out because ads are live a bit longer, every time you get the Soul Spear, you can just run into the melee boss of on top of the boss where nobody is, cloak, and you don't get sent down, you don't take damage, you don't get even knockback. Well, if you play pretty much any other melee, you either A, have to use defensives and go soak it with somebody else on Mythic to survive, and go into under the Spirit Realm and do those mechanics, or even if, say, you're a class that can solo it, like Red Paladins, a few others, you still get sent down. So, say, as a sub-rogue, unless you get targeted by spear pretty much back to back, you're never even going to see the other phase. So you're only going to be staying on top and just AFKing, Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate on top of the boss. Then we get to Maiden, which again, like Maiden, I feel like Maiden is one of the fights that I personally don't like the most because for me the colors of the orbs are really terrible to see. So it's like I say, like if orbs were different color, I would have zero issues with this fight whatsoever. If it was like black and white or something that was had very good contrast between the orbs, that would be perfect fight. I would have zero complaints. For me personally, I don't know if I'm colorblind, if I'm just have shitty eye vision or something, but seeing the difference between very, very, very bright yellow and very, very, very bright green is a bit difficult. Like I messed around with some of the colorblind settings, and at the end of the day, like on Mythic for soaking orbs, I just had to look at the pattern of the swirl on the ground because it pretty much like when I was trying to like play with colorblind, like the colors still didn't really change that much. So the only thing I noticed is like one of them had a thicker outline and lines were like wider on the spin on the ground. But outside of that, again, like if rogues can cloak off the bumps if we get them randomly, rogues can cloak off the bumps if we mess it up. Rogues have cheat deaths, rogues have for some of the times when you get bad bomb during the transition, so you get like a bomb that you need to jump off as the boss blinks to the other side and stuns you, which killed a few people I've seen so far. Like as a rogue, like I think that happened to me like twice when you just shadow step to a friendly target of the same color, so that doesn't kill you. So again, that fight, like the number one issue I would say for me personally is just like seeing the colors of the orbs and knowing which orb is safe and which orb is not. Grand Town Mythic, I will say is that I think that fight is a bit easier for range DPS because so the Mythic mechanics there is you need to soak all of the orbs coming out of the boss. So the way pretty much every single guild handles it is you have on each side you have say melee green and range white in the back and reverse on the other side, which means that melee have to pick up their whichever orbs of their proper color, and as range you don't really have to filter orbs because you know that every single orb that's coming to you, it's going to be your color, so that makes it a bit easier. But I would say that the fight overall, outside of colors, if they were very distinct, that fight would be pretty easy. And in reality, its numbers, it's like damage and health is, I would say, undertuned in Mythic, so it's whatever. Then we get to Avatar, which is again another fight where if I'm like a DK melee, I'm gonna be miserable because every single time that I have to like run out for the big AoE, every time I have to run in, every time I have to like run with Chaos, every time I have to switch to Maiden, if she's not stay tank directly on top of me, pretty annoying. As a rogue, you have Feint for Chaos, so you don't really take that much damage. You can cloak every second big explosion, so I only have to run out for every 2 of them. You have shadow steps, you have mobility, you have soaks, you have pretty much anything you need. So, and the same thing in phase 2. Like phase 2, you can solo your marks, you can shadow step to other people to help them do the marks. You have enough mobility to, even if you get knocked back the wrong way or something, you can survive the fight. While if say as a melee have less room for mistakes in that regard.
Right. Well, and this is something we will definitely talk about at the end because I think a lot of the points you've brought up so far, since we've started recording today, will be reiterated and the piece of news we talk about at the end. But before we dive too specifically into each fight, which we will do here in a minute, I think from what I'm gathering, there are fights that are, and I think there's probably a lot of tiers of raid where there is probably 50-50 in terms of fights that you like and fights that you don't like based on the class or the role you're currently in. And I think if there was ever an entire raid where all of the fights were conducive to like say melee DPS and it was really fun for melee DPS but not fun for range, like that would be a bad design on Blizzard's part. But from what I'm gathering, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, some of the fights are fun because they're very tuned in such a manner that they're very conducive to being a melee DPS, and other fights not so fun just because outside of being a Kasa or a rogue, it's kind of rough for melee, correct?
Yeah, like I said, in general, I would say I kind of like most of the fights they have. Like they're interesting in a way. I feel like the only fights that like I really dislike, just in principle, is Sisters, because it's a fight that's very boring. Like there's nothing happening. It's like you get one mechanic every minute, but just the hell's tuning is so like I know some of the people who, especially who went like more safe strats, like their first mythic kills for 11 minutes, and it's like it's 11 minutes of just AFKing and like there's like one mechanic that you don't want everybody switching over at once. It's pretty much the only mechanics that matters. So I don't know why that fight needs to be 11 minutes long to test that one mechanic. Like it's like I said, that fight overall feels just like too slow and boring for me. Other fights feel like I would say their pacing is fine. Everything else I feel like at that point would be more of a difficulty specific thing and tuning specific things, which like I said, we wanna discuss later.
Sure. Well, and I would have to agree with you on the sisters thing. You know, without taking too much time on this, our group has only done it on heroic and normal, but I have watched quite a bit of the mythic kills that are currently out there, and there's nothing about that fight that feels good to me. Whether you were a tank, a healer, a melee, or a ranged DPS, it's just a fight that just generally does not feel good. And then you add in the whole I'm not 11 minutes thing. It just takes too long. And yeah, so I'm with you there. So, you know, overall, I think we can sum it up to be that there's fights you like, there's fights you don't like, and overall you're kind of just 50-50 with the whole raid in general in terms of melee DPS, liking it or not. But I would like to use our typical format here and move through each of the fights, and as we do, you can kind of talk to how those fights are for a melee DPS, any tips or tricks you can provide to anybody listening in terms of making the fight much more bearable or helping people out in those fights. So without further ado, let's jump straight into things. How is Goroth as a melee DPS?
Honestly, I feel like Goros is like it's a pretty good fight. I feel like it's fine for melee, it's fine for range. You don't have this like insane mechanics of some other fights where you have to like lose a ton of uptime on a boss, especially depending on like how your. I guess it does depend somewhat on how your tank handles it, but overall, like I don't think there's like really any issues with it in particular. It's pretty smooth sailing.
Sure.
I mean, tips for melee. There's I don't know, like I said, I guess it's more of like a specific tips for classic. I know that as a rogue, so you can once again you can cloak every second big knockback, so you can just continue DPSing on a boss. But that's also a fight where unless your tanks like are positioning boss like very far away, you lose very little uptime from actually going and hiding behind the pillars. So that's fine. You can generally we have one or two soaks just under the boss, so melee for mythic only mechanic where you have to soak circles unless big infernal spawn and wipe you. You can do it also without like losing any DPS or maybe like losing like 2 seconds of movement. So like that fight I would say it's fine as melee. It's pretty much every difficulty. Kind of again like it's an introduction fight which is generally not going to be overly hard.
Sure. Well, and I think the general consensus as we move through these bosses, the first 3 bosses, again, like in Nighthold, are kind of a snooze fest and pretty easy on all 3 difficulties. So, yeah, Goroth is pretty easy. I think you've summed it up pretty well. And then from there, most groups are going to Demonic Inquisition, correct?
Yeah. And again, I think Demonic Inquisition is also, it's a fair fight. I don't think there's... I guess it's like one of the fights where like the better you execute, a lot easier it gets. Like I know that on some of our mythic kills, like I look at some of the groups and I see like people going down 4 or 5 times because they're messing up mechanics because they're just not playing well. And I know that like on some of the kills, I think on one of the kills, I don't remember. I might have not gone down at all on one of them. I might have gone down once, but I know that like as you execute better as a raid, the fight just becomes so much easier that it's a joke, kind of. You like the mythic only mechanic is nice that you get more ads that you can cleave on to that spawn when you come out. Overall, again, I don't know, like I don't know if there's really any good melee specific mechanics because it depends on just how your raid plays. Like say if your raid is very good with handling everything and not getting corruption and not having to go down, you generally want to go play like a single target / 2 target boss cleave specs. If your raid is very terrible with execution, you might just want to go and play AoE spec, and just because if you mess up, you do get a lot of little ads in the middle of your fight. So I mean, like that's more of a like raid specific thing.
Right. So I guess in the last and final snooze fest here, Harjatan, what's your thoughts here?
I mean, I actually don't know what the mythic only mechanic is in that fight. I don't think. I mean, that fight, like, I don't know, like I haven't noticed any difference between on it from normal heroic to mythic. I don't. Is that the?
It would be
eggs?
the eggs for the tanks to deal with, basically.
Okay. I mean,
That's
all
my
I know,
understanding, at least.
maybe all I know is that I do know that we get eggs on mythic, which is just like a nice extra targets to cleave and shuriken storm from. I don't really know if they're hard for most groups to handle or anything. I think that's like that was one of the bosses we one shot. So, or at least I hope. I don't even remember. But again, that fight was like, I feel like that fight is honestly the easiest of the three, and that like the first whole thing, because you can mess up on Goras if you have, depending on your tanks. You can mess up on Inquisition if you just don't soak. If you do soak up too many mechanics, if you don't switch to ads, like those fights you can mess up on Harjutan. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, I would say that probably is the easiest of the first three fights.
Really, on Mythic it is?
I would say it is. Like I think like between like the 4 weeks that, or however many lockouts that we've been doing this, I think Harjutan we've wiped like the least numbers.
Huh. That's
But again, like,
go ahead.
like I wouldn't say that any of them are particularly hard. Like, but I just say that like I think for us like Harjutan just happens to be the easiest. It might be different for other people. I'm not sure exactly.
Right on. Well, before we move on, let's see if he's here. He has jumped in the call. Cole, are you there?
Hey, I'm here.
So, Cole, you are finally here. You have joined the call. I know you were out doing some family stuff today. How are you, my man?
Good. Yeah, I was doing lots of family stuff today, so hopefully no more for a while.
When you got home, did you run up the stairs? You sound like you're panting a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's just been busy.
So far we've talked about Gray's opinion on the raid overall, and we've covered the first 3 bosses. Before we move on, just real quick, give us a quick, what have you been up to in game lately?
Oh, man. Really just doing our heroic raid, and I just want to say welcome, Gray. I didn't say that before, but I'm Cole. So that I haven't really been doing much in game, honestly. Just been real busy with work. So
just raiding. So we won't spend too much time on this. Just wanted to quick welcome you into the show.
Yep.
And this is a bit of an unorthodox format for us, but we're gonna make do. Okay, we've talked about Goroth, we've talked about Demonic Inquisition, we've talked about Harjutan now, and this is kind of a point of where we saw some differences in terms of how guilds, which path they take in terms of progression from here. But I guess from here, which way do you guys go, Gray?
I think, well, we went Sisters, because honestly Sisters was a pretty easy fight. And then we went Desolate Host. I'm not even sure which one is easier or harder. I know that some of the like more recent guilds that I've seen that do Sisters says you like, you add an extra healer, you have everybody equip Pride Ass, and then you just make the fight 11 minutes worth of AFK, but you kill it in very few pulls. Like, I think like some of the guilds that like recently was getting it, they were killing it like in 10 or so pulls, just because you have so much room for error with extra healers with Pride Ass. And like I said, there's no really other mechanics to handle. Like, there's not really a very tight damage check. There's none of that.
Yeah, and I know we spent some time before we started jumping into the boss specifically talking about that point. So I would have to agree with you, and I think most everybody in here would say that fight is kind of not fun for anybody. It's just a kind of whatever fight. So from Sisters, you guys moved to where? Mistress?
No, from Sisters we went to Desolate Host.
Okay.
Which was a bit of, I feel like Desolate Host probably was a bit more challenging than Sisters, but still like pretty overall easy to handle fight as long as people realize that again, Desolate Host is another fight where single target matters more than AoE. Like, you don't want to, like, you see a lot of ads and you're like tempted, for Mythic people who have plenty of classes to choose from, you're tempted to like bring in AoE classes. you're tempted to go AoE spec, but at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is single target. Maybe 2-target cleave for the last phase, and even that's not going to last long, so...
So I had a question specifically I wanted to ask you on this fight. In our guild, we have a feral druid, and there's been some points that he's brought up where he has said that being in one realm versus the other is better or worse for him specifically. And I didn't know if this was kind of a melee thing in general. The way we typically handle things when we're setting up groups, like Dan said, I was on vacation this week, so I don't know how they set it up this week. But in our past times we've done the fight, we have typically sent most of the melee to the corporeal realm, and then most of the range to the spirit realm. I don't know what your thoughts are here, that kind of stuff.
I feel like you should balance them both. Simply because if you send, I'm going to be talking from Mythics. I'm not sure if
Sure.
I actually don't know if some of the mechanics are different from Heroic. So when you kill the little ads at the bottom, they're going to come out to the top part. And if you don't have enough range on top, it's going to be very messy. It's how long they're going to take to kill. So that's first of all, I feel like that's why you should try to do your best to balance out like melee and range in terms of top and bottom. Another thing is that, like, I don't know about for Feral Druids specifically. I know for some of the classes, like Sub-Rogues, you do want to stay on top. And probably for, honestly, a few others. Because on top, you have the ads with Bone Shield that usually still take a while longer to die. Either just due to the fact that, like, you don't always get instant channel, or that you might have, like, messed up at the bottom part and killed the spirits. Plus, you can also AoE on them, so that's another nice benefit. So, say like as a sub-rogue or like some other classes that gain from multi-dotting and hitting multiple targets for a single target, you can benefit a lot from that because you can like dodge them up, you can cleave on them, you can cleave from them, and you're not going to kill them, and you're like gaining a single target damage. While if you're staying at the bottom, you're probably not going to get to fully multi-dot and cleave because you can't really risk killing the priestess too soon.
Right. Well, and that's kind of been our typical fashion is when we did it on normal, it was very much all the melee up top, all the range down below. And then when we went to heroic, moved it over to where I put some of the more mobile melee DPS that we have in our group in the spirit realm, just because they could pop in and out of Wailing Souls much quicker and have their uptime on DPS wouldn't be as detrimental to them as, say, somebody like a DK who, unless they have Wraith walk up, they're going to have issues, more downtime in terms of DPS. And then same with some range. I stuck some range in the corporeal realm. And obviously when we get to Mythic, we will, based on what you've said and some other knowledge that we've gained outside of doing this kind of stuff, that we will balance the groups a bit more. But it was kind of a point I wanted to ask, just because when our, like I said, our feral druid mentioned that it was better for him to be in one realm versus the other. I didn't know if there was some good logic behind that or what was going on with the melee issues there. And I guess Cole, you would probably be the better one of the three of us that are normally on the show here to speak to that kind of stuff. And before you actually hopped into the show, I was kind of telling Gray here that you have mentioned more than once since we've been in Tomb that a lot of these fights are not very conducive to melee DPS, and then we also talked about how DHs and paladins are seeing a little bit of underrepresentation from the more progressed guilds just because of the state they're currently in with Tomb.
It's definitely a dot raid, I feel. So any class that has the ability to dot, so just like a sub rogue would shine here, right? Or a unholy DK. But yeah, like I prefer the corporeal realm only because I don't have to switch back and forth a lot. I can have a lot of uptime on the boss. But I could see how, DKs and rogues, I guess you guys can go in and out pretty easily. I'm probably going to switch to a rogue since demon hunters seem to be the class that want to be rogues but can't. So, but yeah.
Never lucky. The traditional demon hunter / red / DK rolling rogues.
Yeah. Yep. A lot of, and I'm wondering what's going to happen next raid, but this is all we have for now. So,
can I reroll rogue?
See if they can tank.
They used to in Black Temple.
Yeah, there have been a few fights where non-tank classes have had some tanking mechanics thrown their way.
Luckily, with the Crucible coming up, that dream might be a reality once more.
Before we move on from this fight, before we move on to this fight, I wanted to get you to voice your opinion on something specifically here with this fight. You had actually kind of alluded to it when you were speaking a little bit ago, but one of the comments or discussions that came out when this Feral Druid in our guild brought up this point was one of the recommendations we made to him, myself and another officer, was that when you're in the corporeal realm specifically, if you're going to be DPSing, don't worry so much about AoE or cleave, because you are going to hit that 50% point where their bone shield is going to prevent them from taking, their 99% damage reduction. And so I think one of the problems, we didn't have a whole lot of time to delve into logs and see what was going on or what he specifically was doing. But one of the blind recommendations we made to him was focus more on single target, and then just do, if you have any sort of natural cleave, those ads will die relatively fine on their own, especially since we have a few classes like Unholy DKs and stuff that are going to have really good AoE and cleave. But I guess from your standpoint, would you not say, and I think you already said this, but would you not say basically jump into this fight with your single target spec and just do any cleave that you do have?
Yeah, like I would say that for most classes, like unless pretty much like all the time, if you're going for AoE and cleave, you have to give up some single target. And really, this is a fight where you're like wiped due to like being overwhelmed by ads. If anything, you wipe very much like Mistress if you kill the ads too soon. So you want to always focus on single targeting. And at the end of the day, like in most raid comps, like I feel like outside of melee, there's range classes are much better at the whole like AoE cleave thing without losing single target damage, like Warlocks, Shadow Priest, Boomkins, to name a few, who can do really strong AoE cleave while still gaining like massive single target damage bonus. So in some respects, like I would say that's like some of the issues we've seen on like some fights, like Avatar, for example, is even if like you can cleave on its very, very minor loss, you might not want to cleave just so that Shadow Priests have more breathing room to like multi-dot ads, Warlocks, all of that.
Right. Well, and I think too, like you had made a point earlier when talking as well in terms of multi-dotting. Like, so when we did a heroic kill, I stuck myself as a destruction warlock up in the corporeal realm, and I would keep my immolates up on some of the ads even when they were at 50%. And we'll talk to this again when we get to kill Jaden. But like during the transition phase where it's just mechanics and not DPSing, I still try and keep my immolate up on Kill Jaden, because the immolate, I'm not keeping it up for damage per se, I'm keeping it up for resource building. And I know some classes, like even on my Shadow Priest, multi-dotting, I've done the normal on my Shadow Priest, gets me insanity or procs my auspicious spirits and stuff like that. And so there is a benefit outside of the damage itself from proccing resources that will, like you said, buff my single target and make it much more easy.
I think even a lot of Warlocks I know, I don't know so much about Destro, I think they like play Affliction and run like infinite dots, and they just like jump between realms and just multi-dot like everything with infinite dots, and it's just like you get a dot and you get a dot and you get a dot, and they're never gonna fall off.
Yeah.
That being said, I'm not the most expert on any like ranged DPS classes, because I think the last time I played like ranged DPS was either in Mogashan as a Frost Mage or like Firelance as a Hunter, so that's been a long time.
Yeah, it's just another way that range is OP right now. They can do that stuff easily and continue gaining resources.
Well, and I think too, Cole, and I think, you and I had spoken to this, and I know other people have been involved in these discussions too, and I think the comment early on was, once we get further into this raid, the further along we get with it being out, we're going to start to see some changes, and I think we are starting to see that, especially with rogues and warriors. They're outperforming almost every class out there right now in a lot of fights. So it's just only time will tell, and I think as they continue to nerf or buff classes or the mechanics in the fight and the raids, that kind of stuff, I think we will start to see things balance out, hopefully, and more melee starting to be viable in there. But so we've talked quite a bit of time now on Desolate Host. So we've talked the first three bosses, and you move to Sisters, and you move to Desolate Host, and I'm guessing you go to Mistress from here.
Yes. So Mistress is probably going to be like the first real, like I would say, like real right like test of how well you can do mechanics, how well you can do damage, how well you can do everything. Because that's one of the harder fights where there's a lot of mistakes you can make. It's just a hard fight, I feel like overall. It's not that quick. So it's gonna take a decent amount of time for you to do it. In addition to it, like it's very easy to make mistakes that are gonna kill you. Like say on Desolate Host, like you can make a bunch of mistakes. Like there's very few of the mechanics there that are gonna like one shot you. And the ones that do happen, they're not gonna happen that frequently, I feel like. While at the same time, if we're talking about Mistress, if you kill the ads too soon, tornado spawn, you die. If you kill the ads too slow, you don't kill, like the tornadoes just cleave onto you. If you don't soak Hydra shots properly, you die. If you get hit by wave, you die. Mythic only mechanic, if you like stand near the fishy buff, you die. If you didn't drop it in time, you die. So I feel like there's a lot like Mistress has a lot more effectively one-shot mechanics that if you fail them, you just die. And especially with the change after the first week, which that change I actually really don't like how he did it. So one of the first strats was to prevent cheesing, so to say, was people would use double DK tanks. In addition, like if they would use 2 DK tanks plus whatever tanks they have normally. And those tanks would stand and soak every single Hydra shot. So on Mythic there's 4 Hydra shots. Your DK tank stands and soaks all 4 of them with a cloak. So the Azir don't get stunned, or they get stunned for 4 seconds, but they don't really take that much damage because they're a tank. And that makes execution so much easier for everyone, because it means that you don't have to really like spread people to soak properly. What Blizzard did to change that is, of course, instead of saying like, hey, DKs can break those stuns, maybe we should rework that, or maybe we should do anything, they're like, well, now it's a 30-second stun. So now what it also means that even if you're not intentionally soaking all of them, but you messed up, you got hit by 2 of them, you get stunned for 30 seconds, which pretty much means that you die. So that part I really don't get, because if you're trying to prevent that specific cheese strat, I'm not really sure why you can't just say that like you get 6 seconds per line you hit, or something of that nature, or even say like 4 seconds, or say just like scale. It's like if you soak 1 line, you get stunned. If you soak 2 lines, you get 6 seconds. If you soak 3 lines, you get like 12 seconds. If you soak 4 lines, you get 30 seconds, which means that you still don't want people soaking all of the lines because they still get stunned, but you're not as punished for that like a single individual mistake. Because that seems kind of strange to me. Like the whole swing from like let's stun you for 6 seconds to let's stun you for 30 seconds. But it's one of the issues, I would say.
Yeah, and I know that there have been some other posts in community-based discussions, whether it be forums, podcasts, what have you, that have revolved around this specific fight and changes they have made to it to change the tuning on it, rather. And there have been some people that liked it, a lot of people that don't. And so, but I tend to agree with you on this fight with the stuns and stuff like that. It's just kind of it's an interesting way to approach it, I feel like. But as our guild is yet to get there in Mythic, I can only dread, I guess would be the word I am, in terms of what is going to be the progression for our group on there. But, whatever, you're going to have those fights. So.
I don't want to get there. I want to skip it.
Well, as a melee, how do you feel about this fight?
I was talking about earlier, so I feel like as a melee, as a rogue melee, I feel this fight is fine. I don't really have any particular issues with it. As a non-rogue melee, I feel like there's a lot, again, more margins for error there, because as a rogue you can Shadow Step gives you a lot of freedom on this fight, so does Cloak, so does She Does. So you can make more mistakes. So I feel like the only. So if you make mistakes, that fight is a lot easier for rogues than other classes. If you don't make mistakes, that fight might be a bit harder, because once you get the Murlocs, especially in the last phase on Mythic, they do a lot of damage. And that's like bleeds that stay on you that are physical and not magic is one of the few mechanics that rogues are like especially vulnerable against. So I felt like on Mythic, at least when we got to it, if I have that mechanic on me, I am just like I'm in for a bad time because it's going to be doing a ton of damage that I can't mitigate unless I spec into one of the talents, which removes cheat deaths. So it's like a very
It's a trade-off, yeah.
it's a very risky trade-off, and even if I'm keeping up that talent, it's actually a pretty big like DPS loss because you have to keep it up for like 2 minutes. So
Yeah, how many? I get you may have answered this earlier, but how many like melee do you have in your raid, or do you switch them out for this fight, or?
we have Enhancement Shaman, Demon Hunter, Windwalker, Armed Warrior, 2 Rogues, and we had 2 Red Paladins, but they've gone to the afterlife.
The dark side.
Yes.
Did your so you do have a Demon Hunter? That's interesting. A lot of guilds don't, and it's kind of disheartening. But
I mean, it's fine. Our Demon Hunter is gearing up his rogue. He's a happy little fellow.
yeah, exactly.
He got his shoulders on his rogue. He's excited.
Now, what about your Windwalker? I know Windwalkers have been kind of in a weird state since the beginning of this expansion, and they've been kind of underrepresented, I feel like, as a whole in this expansion. But is your Windwalker, is he doing okay, or is he making the switch to Rogue as well?
I mean, I feel like he's doing okay. Like he's actually was very instrumental in terms of our maiden strat, and that like his damage cooldowns line up perfectly with her shield, so he is able to do a ton of damage and really simplifies that mechanic. On the same side, he does have a rogue now. He also has a cloak, so he's also getting that geared up. So both of our Demon Hunter and Windwalker are trying to transition to playing a rogue.
Well, the fear there, I think, for anybody is inevitably, and you've already alluded to this, is there still exists the possibility that people can make the switch, and all of a sudden Blizzard will change things, and it'll be kind of like you made the switch for nothing. I hope that isn't the case, but
well,
only time will tell.
I think this raid is too far along for them to change anything that drastic.
Well,
it'll definitely be next patch.
Well, that's a challenge that Blizzard's always happy to accept.
Yeah.
That's true.
Okay, so that's Mistress. I'm guessing you go to Maiden here, right? Since we're already talking about Maiden.
Yeah. So I feel like I complained before that I feel like I kind of hate Maiden for the color schemes that they chose. Like for me personally, like it's hard to see the difference between the orbs. And I would say for me personally, that's basically the only difficult part of that fight. So everything else would be very, very tolerable. Like I don't mind. Again, Maiden, I do have to say that I feel like Maiden would be easier for ranged DPS, especially on Mythics and Melee. But the difference isn't that drastic, especially if you can see the color. So I feel like Maiden is fine for Melee overall.
Yeah, I like Maiden. Maiden lines up really well with a lot of cooldowns for classes. So
now I know one of the big changes here from Heroic to Mythic, which I feel like Melee would be very instrumental in, is the fact that no balls can go unsoaked. So you have to have people from Fel and Light on both sides, whereas I think you typically let your Melee be the ones to be on the opposing side, so that they're soaking the balls up front, and then the respective players from that side. So, your Fel Melee are up front on the Light side, and then everybody who's Light are behind them soaking the Light balls in the back, and then on the opposite side, right?
Well, actually, we have it opposite. So, like, if say is a Fel side, if there is like a Fel side, like it's basically the sides for our Melee. So, like our Melee say like Fel side, then that's a Fel side, and they just have holy people behind them. But like it's the same because you get random ball spawns on both sides.
Right. So
what happens if you miss a orb? Is that a mechanic that she gets stronger or blows up? So
for every missed orb, you take some raid damage, and you gain and like increasingly stacking debuff that makes you take more damage from missed orbs. So you can miss like 1 or maybe 2 orbs, but any more than that, and it gets really tricky, and you get a much higher risk of dying. And see, that's another mechanic that like it's good for Melee because you can stand on top of her and soak all of the orbs, and you like still DPSing, but at the same time, as a range, there's this wonderful class called Hunters, which means that you stand at 30-yard range, and you just jump around, going ook, farming the same orbs. And like I said, the one thing that's easier for range than Melee in this fight is, as a range, and during that like transition phase, you know that any orb coming towards you is going to be your color, so you don't even really have to like as a melee, you have to like look, you have to pay attention, you have to make sure that you don't soak the wrong orb.
Yeah.
As a range in that fight, especially because of mythic mechanics, you know that already all of the orbs of the proper color on your side have been soaked, so you can just go whichever lane and soak them. And you know that even if they haven't been soaked, you need to soak them to prevent the wipe, so you just like pop a defensive and you soak them. So
my other question to you is on this fight, and this is one of the things we dealt with on our progression in normal heroic with her, is that when melee are up front, when the balls drop and they hit the ground, as they drop, you can't really distinguish what color they are. And I know you've already said that between the different colors you have a hard time, but it's the
opposite actually. So for me, I can't tell the colors of the balls themselves apart. It's very hard.
Right.
But the swirlies on the ground are very easy for me to distinguish.
Really?
Because
Okay.
Not even so much the color as much as it's hard to explain, but it's like they have a different shape. Like I know one of them is a lot like thicker outlines than the other one. So for me, like when we were doing progression that boss, like I would just look at the shape of a swirly and I would just remember like which colors the orb is. And that made it really easy to like stand on the like two separator lines, and you look at the swirly shape, and based on that you move in and out.
Interesting.
Now is her hitbox big enough that you can stand a little bit back, like more towards max range for melee, and give yourself a little bit more room and time to be able to figure out which ones are which?
I would say yes. Like I said, I never really had an issue with like moving into orbs if I knew that which colors they are, or really figuring out the color of a spin.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I just curious about that one because we had some questions about that in one of our raids. And as somebody who doesn't play melee since quite some time now, I didn't really know how to speak to it. So that definitely will be useful for us moving forward. Okay, so we've done all the fights up to Maiden. Now we've done Maiden, and now we are at, I guess the next boss is where you guys are at in progression, which is Avatar, no?
Yeah.
So
how's this fight?
Yeah, how is that fight from Mythic standpoint as melee?
So again, if you're not like rogue, that fight is going to be much more miserable for melee than a rogue, which is, I can say that's going to be the case for pretty much every single fight this tier.
Yeah, that seems to be.
But I mean, again, like it just so happens that like rogues are really good at negating mechanics in this fight. Like if you need, like it's really easy to survive on bound cast when you can feint it and take very little damage from it because you have all of the damage reductions. You can cloak every second big runaway mechanic. Don't know the name. Don't really particularly care. You can cloak the marks in last phase. You have the mobility from shadow steps and like to get back from the knockups from marks if you had to soak somebody else, or say position yourself so you can soak multiple people's mark even without cloak. Like you can say like walk into one person's mark, feint, you get knocked up, you shadow step to another person, you soak his orb too. I mean his mark, which makes it a lot easier on healers in last phase. For other melee, I say it also depends a lot on mobility. Like I don't think that I would have a good time playing a DK. Because how mobile they are when you have like cast, which you want to move out from people, the run back mechanic, which you want to move out when like second phase you might need to cover like large distances with platform breaking, so like that. Like DK I would not want to play. I feel like other classes are more or less okay in that fight because they have their strength. Like warriors are really good until last phase because it's execute, so you really need to push that damage. Monks just have generally pretty good mobility. You have pretty good defensives. Same as demon hunters.
Yeah, that one's not too bad for demon hunters. Other than all melee has to move out off the boss whenever he does his cast, but that's kind of annoying. But yeah, I can see how DKs would be a pain on that fight.
I mean,
yeah, I'll let you guys know about DK in a couple of weeks.
Even the favorite melee of this entire expansion, survival hunters, are pretty fine because you can disengage, you can grappling hook back in, you have turtle so you can stand on melee range, you have turtle so you can solo suck marks. So like even for survival, that fight would be okay. In terms of mechanics, I don't really know how they would do on damage on fights.
Exactly,
they don't get to smash butchery.
They're very they rely on butchery a lot, and they make one mistake and their DPS is pretty much gone. So that would be a hard fight for survival as well. But they could cheese mechanics, so.
Yeah. And I mean, on Mythics, that fight is pretty much the same. I know that, again, like, for Not so much for like melee themselves, but for rogues that fight. Rogues are really good on this fight because there's more soaks that you need to get that do more damage, and rogues can consistently solo each one without a cooldown. You just walk in and feint. If you're playing Assassination, which a lot of people are on Mythic, you walk in, you press feint in Crimson Vial, and you don't really have big issues with surviving that fight.
Now, are you hopping back and forth between sub and assassination depending on the fight?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
So
I mean, I could definitely see now how Blizzard could screw you guys over. Just remove any of your mechanics that can soak this stuff, and rogues will fall down, which they will probably do, which is unfortunate.
And this is why I am leveling ults.
Come on, they bounce back every expansion. Rogues end up on top regardless.
Well, it's not so much about the damage as much as about mechanics. I feel like right now you have like a can of worms, which is Cheat Desk, Cloak of Shadows, Feint. Because right now, and this has been a thing for a while, I mean, like, since when did Feint get that strong? I want to say Dragon Soul. Feint get like changed from whatever it was before, like Dread Drop, to massive like AoE damage reduction. I think it was maybe like Dragon Soul, maybe even before. Yeah. But it's like you had rogues who, for the last like 2 or 3 expansions, have been really good at soaking and surviving that. So at this point, I feel like Blizzard are hitting like, I mean, it's also I feel like it's been a pretty poor mechanics design this year, where pretty much every single boss is like soaks this line or soaks this circle, which is like, well, you have a class that's really really good at soaking. It's probably gonna do really good on those mechanics. Like if there's like if mechanics for like soak this and get a stacking bleed on your rogues would be like, nope, not doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I feel like that's part of it was just like I would say poor design from Blizzard to some extent. But I mean, like rogues have been always like really good soaking class, and damage. I mean, rogues bounce back with damage reliably, but even say ignoring the damage. I feel like if at some point Blizzard decides that, like, no, we've had enough of this, that's going to be a pretty big change to Rogue's overall, because there's been, like, at this point, you might as well say that, like, soaking mechanics is part of Rogue's class fantasy.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I know that if anything happens to my lovely Cloak Cheat Death Feint combo, I'm going to go and write a big post in forums explaining how that sabotages my class fantasy. And how that goes against the core idea of Legion of promoting class fantasy.
But yeah, I mean, Tomb is definitely Sargeras, I guess. Tomb of Sargeras, where the rogue class definitely shines. And that's where I wonder, so the first, like, Nighthold was, I guess, AoE and range. This one's kind of the dot classes and classes that have the ability to soak easily. I wonder what the next raid's going to be. Are they going to mix them, or is it going to be another just... I feel like these have been range-heavy raids so far, so I wonder what they're going to do.
Well, the problem is, when you look at fight designs, if there's any sort of fight where there's going to be mobility involved, your range classes just naturally are going to tend to be favored there, with the exception of a few classes. Based on any other mechanics that may or may not be involved. And we'll definitely talk about this at the end when we talk about the news piece. But that is one of the big complaints right now with this raid in terms of tuning, is there's a lot of fights that are evolved around or made infinitely more easy by bringing classes with immunities to them, rogues being a big favorite right now. But you also have your mages and your hunters, your paladins, even though paladins are pretty low on the charts at the moment.
Paladins.
Right.
Yeah, I feel bad for paladins, but they've been good forever, so
you know a class is in a bad state when a guild who needs to bring classes with immunities still doesn't bring a rep paladin because their damage is that low on the charts.
Well, I feel like it also really depends. Like I know that for the 2 fights where you really need immunities are Avatar and KJ. And again, Avatar is a fight where Red Paladins don't exactly shine, in part due to like number of mechanics. Plus, again, like their immunity is probably the worst one of them all. Is like just Divine Shield, because you can't bop anything on Avatar. And KJ, Red Paladins are actually unique in that there's the only, well, Paladins in general are the only class that has no way of surviving a mistake with the knockback warp. Because every other class in spec can either A, have like a ton of ways of like getting back on a platform, or B, can go Goblin. if you're Horde, which of course you are. Paladins are the only ones who can't do anything to prevent themselves from being knocked off, because they don't have any like Shadow Step, Disengage, Gust of Wind, Teleport, something else, Blink.
Yeah.
And they don't have the ability to go Goblin and get Rocket Jump, which is always unlucky for them.
Yeah, I've watched the method kill on KJ a few times now, and it's those dealing with the orbs and the knockbacks is kind of crazy, which, I guess is a good point for us to transition into it now. I know you said your group is on Fallen Avatar, and I guess most groups would be considering only 4 guilds have killed Mythic KJ, but I do know. So from what you do know or what you have experienced in heroic and stuff like that, why don't you kind of give us your thoughts on KJ here as a melee DPS?
So on heroic, KJ as a melee DPS is, I feel like, perfectly fine. Like phase 1 is wherever there's enough soaks in a melee range from the boss that you can like soak and do damage without losing anything. Like the AFK during phase 2 when he's flying but attackable is pretty much irrelevant, because most range classes aren't going to be doing damage to him anyway. There's like 99% damage reduction, so you don't really care about that. Phase 2, phase 2 is also fine. Like there's nothing really that exciting happening there, I would say. The Darkness phase is a bit interesting because you benefit a lot from having like a Hunter or a, Druids. Just go Cat form and ping Illidan. But that phase, like, melee can also, like, do fine, I feel like. Obviously, range, I would assume, be better, but not so much because of the limited range in your sight. So, as a melee, you don't really, like, lose that much compared to range. And the last phase is, I feel like, the only questionable one, with, like, the pillars and the orbs. But generally, you have, like, somebody kiting the orb away, so it's not going to affect you anyway. And the pillars, pretty much everybody gets hurt by them anyway. And looking at Mythic, it seems like there is a way to kind of bait the pillar spawns, which makes like range run out and stand in particular spots. So as a melee, since you don't have to do it, life isn't so bad, I guess. But I feel like
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Like when I was looking at World First video, you can see that their Shadow Priest like runs out like number, like I would say like 4 seconds before filler spawns, and one always spawns next to him. But I'm not exactly sure like how exactly the whole baiting out pillars mechanic works. Might be like kind of like I said, that I'm not sure. We haven't really had that much practice with it, and there's not too much information available right now that I've seen, at least regarding like how to do that mechanic, which is obvious because like so few guilds killed it.
Yeah.
Well, and I noticed that very thing too, and it's something I plan on looking into at some point here, because I found that funny too, and it was always the Shadow Priest doing it. So I'd be curious to see as to why they're using the Shadow Priest, or what specifically about that mechanic is being done to cause that.
Have y'all killed Mythic Avatar? Are you working on KJ right now?
No, we've had like a 3% wipe on Mythic Avatar, so we're hopefully gonna kill him on Monday, and then possibly look at KJ and like starting next week.
That's cool.
Start considering KJ.
Yeah, I definitely that fight seems pretty exciting. I didn't know they could still do the Druid humanoid thing, Druid and Hunter. I wish Demon Hunters could use our spectral sight and see him hiding. That would make sense, but
well, the tricky thing is that he's not a demon; he's a humanoid. So
which I guess that's where the disconnect is, because class fantasy, right? He's a demon, so, well, half demon, I guess, just like me.
Yeah, both in real life and in game. So.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, I think right now we're at a good point where we've talked about each of the fights specifically, and unfortunately right now I think the general consensus is, for any of you out there who are tuning in to the show, who may not be playing a rogue, or an arms warrior, you're just
doing it wrong.
Right? Yeah, you're doing it wrong, and I think that in itself, because of the fact that the whole "you're doing it wrong" is quite a bit truthful at the moment. It speaks volumes to Blizzard should be doing some things differently. I think Nighthold was in a really good spot in terms of the classes being balanced really well, and I think right now we're seeing a larger imbalance than we had previously. So hopefully they do some things to bring that back into line. But
yeah, I mean, is it really a bad thing? Like, I know it kind of separates the melee and range. I was thinking about this the other day. Having one raid where ranged or dot classes and ranged is kind of outperforming melee, is it such a bad thing?
No, I don't think.
I feel like it's fine when the split is, say, between like melee outperforming range or range outperforming melee, because I mean it's always going to happen to some extent. Like,
definitely.
Like if you look at comps, like say like if that happened on pretty much every single tier, as long as it doesn't get to like Alakir strats when you have like hunters, or what was it, like I think like one of the first Hands and Friends kills when it like ran like 13 hunters or something of that nature. Like it's fine. I feel like the bigger issue is the gaps within the class. Like on one hand, you have like from range that is bad. I mean, that's actually I can't really think from the top of my head like range class is particularly bad, but it's like on one hand you have like Arms Warrior, on the other hand you have a Red Paladin, and it's like, why would you play a Red Paladin when you can play an Arms Warrior?
Yeah.
And I think that's my point, is not necessarily, I'm totally in agreement with you guys in terms about, this is a range favored raid, this is a melee favored raid. But I think the gaps, whereas like even in Nighthold, if you wanted to play, like if you look at a Frost Mage versus a Fire Mages had a harder time doing well, but they still did well. They could perform well enough that there wouldn't be any real big detriment outside being a world first guild to bring them to a raid. Same thing with Arcane, Frost, or whatever. But now you were definitely seeing a point where specific classes in melee, or even specs for that matter, you just, even from a more casual progression guild, you just don't want to bring them to raid. The gaps between the classes inside of melee, or even specs within a class, are much larger in a lot of respects, and I think that they need to fix that, in my opinion.
And it's definitely like, if you're a hunter, why play survival when you can play marks, right? Or right now in the Demon Hunter Discord, a lot of them are switching over to rogue, because right now rogues are basically better demon hunters, especially for soaking and DPSing, right?
Also more stylish.
Well, so like I was thinking about this. So if you look at Mythic's kill, I believe they had 6 rogues. I believe it was either 5 or 6. I can't remember the specific number. But outside of like maybe Star Augur and Nighthold, where groups were bringing like 4 or 5 Shadow Priest for the execute phases, you very rarely are you seeing guilds stack more than 3 or 4 of any one class, even in like the world race, right? You had a little bit of that with Mistress. Some guilds very early on were stacking Blood DKs to deal with the stuns and the soaks. But to bring 6 rogues or 5 rogues, like that to me just speaks volumes in terms of this tuning is not where it should be.
They have to be Blood Elf female rogues. That's the only thing that matters.
And the thing is, I will even say that like with had rogue specific tuning, the issue like it's not even just the tuning. The issue is the class design. Like, I feel like that's the biggest thing, that like rogues could be doing like Kret's level of damage, and they would still be brought in for Avatar and KJ because they're that good at soaking mechanics right now. And I feel like that's a failure of raid design when you design how I feel like Exorsus GM makes a good point about it when they design, like you have like a beam on Mythics that's doing 30 million damage split between people. Like how many people do you exactly expect to soak this? And it's like, how do you exactly expect to tune it when you have like Croaks who take 50% less damage, and some of the other classes can like soak it somewhat reliably, versus like Enhancement Shaman or like a Red Paladin. Like, ooh, what's good Red Paladin gonna do? Like pop his Divine Shield?
Yeah. Well, so I think this is a really good point where we could transition into the news segment, where we usually pick 1 or 2 things to speak about. And for those of you listening, I will include the link in the show notes. But recently, Exorsus' guild leader released a post where he had 4 segments where he talked about, starting with his general thoughts in terms of the raid. So he talks about, the difficulty curve from one boss to the next throughout Mythic progression in Tomb. And then he has another segment where he talks about what was wrong with Tomb in his eyes. And then he talks about some just kind of like some myths that are currently out there in the community about hardcore raiding mythics. And then the last one he talks about, where he actually has 5 segments. I apologize, but the fourth one he talks about kind of just thoughts on current mythic raiding, the issues with it, or just issues in general with WoW in its current state. And then he obviously has a conclusion. But kind of what we're alluding to is one of the points he brought up was in terms of his issues with the tuning. So a lot of the tuning right now in Tomb has been designed for classes with either immunities or better soaking abilities, which is, again, like Gray said, a lot of the groups are bringing rogues, and it's not necessarily just for their damage. It's for their ability to soak. And that, so the question for me here is, when looking at, okay, this is clearly a problem. We're bringing and we're stacking a lot of classes that can deal with soaks or immunity, using immunities or other soaking abilities. When clearly that's a problem. So we know it's a problem. We know it exists. So if you're in Blizzard's eyes, how do you go about approaching to fix this? Do you start moving away from using these types of boss mechanics where it's very favored with, immunity or soaking classes, or do you change the classes themselves? And in my personal opinion, you don't change the class. You don't hurt the player because you made a bad decision in the design, right? Like, that to me just seems really backwards and can make a class feel bad to play, in my opinion. What are your guys' thoughts here? Feel free to jump in, anybody.
Yeah,
well,
I agree.
as somebody with zero bias in this question, I do feel like rogues have like honestly, so at this point it's like a class fantasy. It's like, like if there's like some mechanics that you need to soak of like a particular type, it's like AoE, that's like a circle on the ground, that's like a beam going into something, that's like a line that splits damage. Like, rogues have been the soaking class. Like, that's a lot of their like class appeal. Like, I mean, like, it's nice knowing that like you bring some utility, and your utility takes that form. And like that's been the case for like many expansions. So I feel like at this point, if Blizzard's not happy with like this class mechanic, the issue isn't particularly with class mechanic. It's like, if you design the whole raid that every single mechanic can be soaked like that, then maybe you should do something different. Like, if it was like single target, like something that was like, say, single target abilities that only hit like one person and couldn't be split, which means that feint doesn't work, and was doing physical damage, which means cloak doesn't work, and would leave a dot on you, which means that you can't like cloak it off. It means that all of a sudden rogues are not like demanded, and you might want to bring like paladins with their like bobs, divine shields, everything.
Yeah,
So,
I think the problem is the soak mechanic, but how do you vary a raid to get rid of something that's so core to like a boss design? Because we've had these forever, right?
Cole, you make them go brewmaster monks. End of story.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing that like you had the same like soak mechanic exactly. Like in, what was it? On Blackhand, you had the speeders, which brewmasters were soaking, which like rogues couldn't soak, because that was like a tank thing. You could, I think initially before they, I think like during the first week of like Blackhand, you could also just soak them with like mages who would like ice block, eat the spears, ice block out. You could have the same thing with like some other classes. So it's like so as soon as you like switch the school of damage from like magic to physical, already rogues are a lot less useful on soaking because they can't cloak. They usually can't evasion and riser, which basically means only feint. If it's like something that leaves a pretty big dot on you, you're not going to be soaking it because you're going to be taking massive damage, and you might want to like leave it to, say, like even like a warrior who can go defensive stance, sure, lose some damage, but also have damage reduction versus the same rogue. So like, I don't know, I feel like there's plenty of ways you can make soaks, even just like make a soak mechanic that doesn't necessarily mean that rogues are going to be the best for it.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you, and that was one of the points I was going to make. And my other question here is, when considering this issue, so right now only 4 guilds have killed Mythic KJ. Exorsus has killed it, Method has killed it, and then 2 Asian guilds, 1 Korean, 1 Chinese guild have killed it. But when we start getting into the groups that may not necessarily play enough or be hardcore enough that everybody has 2 or 3 alts in the wing to switch to, how are guilds that don't have 6 rogues sitting on their roster gonna be able to kill Jaden? You know, obviously, clearly, there's gonna have to be a lot of nerfs or changes, correct?
Well, I mean, it also depends. Like, I would say that right now, most of the guilds that I would say like top 50 world, let's say even top 40 world, most of them at this point have more than enough time to have 1 or 2 melee go rogue, and it's pretty acceptable. Like if you only need rogues for sucking mechanics, like you can gear them up pretty quickly because it's like you don't care about getting them like perfect tier pieces, perfect relics, perfect anything. Because like if they're doing damage, it's nice, but rogue is like a soaking mechanic with some damage attached to it.
So I guess my question is like, let's say our guild, like I don't know if we'll ever get to Mythic KJ. That would be great. We'll just have to see where our progression takes us. But let's say a guild that normally always clears a full Mythic content in a tier, but they typically don't do it until, you know, the
like last few weeks, let's say.
Right, yeah. So how are they going to deal with that if nothing changes? Because a lot of those players don't have the ability or are not going to switch to a different character, right? If they play, like, let's say if they're a Ret Paladin, they're going to play a Ret Paladin no matter what the status of the raid is in.
I feel like at that point, a lot of those soak mechanics that right now you have rogues doing, like say, namely like Avatar, again, not 100% sure on like KJ. At that point, like this gear and everything, you're still going to be able to kill. I feel like it's a bigger issue is just overall tuning and fight difficulty of Avatar and KJ compared to previous expansions. Like say, it doesn't. I don't think it like your gear would matter as much, like or your class, even for that matter, would matter as much on KJ as much as just ability to do mechanics, because those mechanics, like looking at them, like that's a very mechanically intensive fight. Like looking at some of the like guilds I've raided in the past, like you can have everybody go rogue, you can give everybody like whatever like max item level gear, like, and they're still going to be able to do it because it's a very mechanically complex fight. You're not going to have an easy fun time doing it.
Right.
Yeah, I think I mean, how does Blizzard, so with the mythic content and KJ and everything, let's just say what, like 100 guilds finally kill him by the end. How do you think Blizzard feels about creating this content for only 5,000 players in their player base? Like, is that time like spent well for them, or is that why things aren't progressing fast? Is because, or like their tuning hasn't been quick? Is it because they're not really worried about Mythic, or like how do you feel being a Mythic raider that Blizzard is treating Mythic raiders?
I mean, honestly, it's a bit hard to say because I feel like Mythic, all of this Mythic tuning is very important because I feel like at the end of the day, if you say like remove all of the Mythic raids, or say you just like drastically nerf them, and the game might not die instantly, but there's going to be a very big influx, or not influx, exflux, or whatever it is, of raiders from just the game. Because right now, like, let's say a lot of the guilds I know, like, they clear heroic like the first week on like 5 tunes. Like there's like a lot of mythic guilds like just full clear heroic first day, like first week. So what is they gonna do? Like, I mean, like, yeah, like part of it is gear, but especially if we say like how current Mythic Plus system is designed, like a lot of raiders, like you're gonna be clearing it the first day, even if there's no Mythic raids, because there's still like Mythic Plus gear, there's still PvP gear, which is every once in a while becomes an interesting thing in PvE to discuss. So at that point, it's like, what are you gonna have? Like, you're gonna have like Final Fantasy, where you wait like 2 years for an expansion. You log in, you play for a week, you kill the end boss, and then you quit for another 2 years. So I feel like there still has to be like Mythic raiding, even if like some people, like I know like plenty of people who like do heroic raiding and happy and don't really care or plan on doing Mythic. But it's still there, and it's still like kind of like the apple on the tree. Like if you remove that apple, like a lot of like so many of the raiders are just gonna quit, and the more of those raiders quits, I feel like it's gonna have like trickle down effect on raiding economy. Haha.
And I agree with you there. I think there has to be some sort of separation, the men from the boys, so to speak, in terms of leaving some sort of difficulty barrier in place where there kind of exists a certain level of prestigiousness given to the very few that are able to achieve such things versus the majority of the population. Because I think if you dumb things down enough, you are absolutely 100% correct in terms of you will lose a lot of your hardcore player base and the quality of the game will disappear because diversity and variance in terms of what the game has to offer is key to a healthy ecosystem. And I think Blizzard has done a good job of that. You know, we can sit here and complain. And I think one of the big things that people need to understand is when we do complain about things, we are complaining about things in a very, very magnified look or spectrum rather. These are, when you look at the overall health of the game and the overall picture that the game represents, these are very, very minute problems, very, very specific problems, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to see how many guilds have cleared heroic, you know, like fully cleared, and how many by the end of the patch have done it, and compare that to Mythic and see, you know, where most of the players spend their time, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I guess Mythic Raiders don't do heroic anymore, right? Or if you do, you just do it for Titan Forge.
Well, and I know you kind of jumped into the call late, and so I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read the article I linked you. But the author of this, the guild leader of Exorsus, that's one of the things he talks about one of the many things he talks about is, you know, they raid heroic, they do split runs, you know, the first 3, 4, 5 weeks at some point, and then you definitely reach a point, like they're already at a point, when they were in progression killing certain bosses, the item level of the gear the boss was dropping was either at an equivalent item level of the characters in the raid, or even a few item levels lower, because of the Titan forging system, because of the split runs and heroics, because of gear obtainable outside in Mythic Pluses, that kind of thing. And this goes further into talk about some of the problems with that type of system and that type of design. You know, and obviously there's a little bit of caveat to that, which he alludes to, because, you know, you could be, all of the gear on your character could be 925 to 930, but because you have 2 970 legendaries and a weapon that's item level could be, you know, 950, 960, whatever, you're going to have a bit of variance in the overall item level askew up of what really is representative of your character's item level. But it's a very well written article, and I was telling Gray before we started recording, you know, before I read this article, my general overview of Exorsus was I wasn't a huge fan of them. I've always been kind of leaning more towards, like, if I were to be a fanboy, so to speak, the method stuff. But after I read this article, my tune or my opinion of Exorsus and their mentality towards the game has definitely changed. It's I happen to agree with almost every single point he makes in this article. It's a very well written out article. And
yeah, let's get a check.
Yeah, he does a very good job of explaining a lot of the issues we have been complaining about since day one of Legion. And we won't spend a ton of time on this. I just wanted to hit a few talking points.
Do they want to even kill KJ again? Like, once you beat the mythic boss, the end boss, do you even want to go back in there and do it?
And they rekilled it after the nerfs, and they talking about how I think like after the nerfs went out, because they killed it before the nerfs, and then like literally like the next day or something, like the same lockout, they basically nerfed the boss. And they talked about how for the second kills they brought in like 2 new people and they killed it on 3 pulls, or they brought in like 3 new people and killed it on 2 pulls. How like compared to like how it was before the changes, how is that like completely trivialized the fight? And one thing I have to say is that like in regards to the whole like Merit versus Exorsus fanboy, I like Exorsus more because they're a lot more open about their issues with Blizzard. And they're a lot, I would say, more open regarding some of the things we do. Like we have, like every year we get the whole like drama about, like account sharing, like guilds getting banned. And like this year it was Limit. Like that was the whole big like drama of is like, Limit got banned because they do real money sales. Limit got banned because they like share accounts. And even then like the whole account sharing for a Limit was like very questionable. Like I think I kind of posted said that after like the first bans, they got like old accounts of players who don't even like play the game. They like transferred some like whatever ults that were irrelevant, who just literally had AK, and then like they would play this like those tunes from like whatever like undergeared things they were, and they would like raid on them. And then they got rebanned for it like as account sharing. And like you look at that, and then you look at how there's like multiple, and Exorsus talked about a lot during, I want to say it was like TOV. I don't even think it was Nighthold. As he talked about how there's like a lot of like other high-end guilds, you can see how they just go out and they buy like characters. Like you can see that like some characters like with like randomly like tunes with best of slot legendaries would appear in some guilds all of a sudden. Big surprise there. Who could possibly expect it? And that was like one thing, but people like dismissed it. But then during this year, you could see in Edit how all of a sudden like some of the rogues of like somebody's rogue ult would suddenly like be renamed and end up on somebody else's account, and same thing with mages and a few other tunes, and it's like, oh, obviously they're doing like the same like account sharing as other guilds, even more to some certain extent, according to some of the Twitch clips of everybody's favorite streamers. I mean, feral streamers, where it's like, oh, let me check my macros. Oh, I have account login info for like 5 other accounts of my raiders. Must have been a really fun LAN party where everybody decided to show up at my house and play WoW from my computer. What an odd coincidence. How could that ever possible? But of course. And I mean, outside of that, I mean, like, I don't think if anybody honestly believes that like top end guilds don't do real money sales, they're 100% delusional. Like, there's the amount of money going into all of those guilds. Like, you know that they do real money sales. The real question is just how obvious they are when they do it. And I mean, like, I don't think it's exactly a good idea. Is it like you ban one guild because they're more obvious about real money sales, but you don't ban the other one because they just do it hush hush? Like, I don't know. That's
What if you do like you buy this T-shirt, this has our logo on it, and then we'll run you through something? Would that get around the real money sales type of thing?
And I mean,
they're still getting money, but just for their merchandise.
Limited time offer.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, the thing is that like they do the same like exact real money sales, just it's even less advertised than like from other guilds. Like, it's like, I feel like the T-shirt and the whole thing, that's something they would like guilds would do if there was like actual like legal persecution. Say, like, I mean, like, I know that a bit off topic from WoW, but one of my friends in Europe, he was like operating something at the beach, and they weren't allowed to rent out like boats or something, or like, I don't know, like, so basically they weren't allowed to rent out anything because they didn't get a license. So what they did is they started selling different colored balloons. And with the purchase of each balloons, you get a complimentary like 1 hour of like, say, boat rent. And that lasted for like a season until they got a license without like getting into serious legal trouble. And again, that's more of a topic for like lawyers who can discuss like, oh well, how obvious it is with like clearly like the intent is not what you're doing, and so on and so on. But then of a day, like, yeah, like there's ways to bypass it, but there's a difference in like there's ways to bypass it with like the whole legal like shenanigans, and when there's like you still do the same sales, you just like act just slightly more subtle about them than like other guilds.
Well, and I think the big takeaway from a discussion like this is when you remove any of the workarounds or any of the side topics with it, and just look at the problem in its essential naked state, its natural state of being. The biggest problem here is when you compare a world first mythic raider who is essentially a professional gamer compared to any other esports or professional athlete in the world. WoW raiders have a harder time of getting paid for what they do, which is probably one of the bigger arguments with the EU versus the Americas, is they don't make a lot of money. You know, they have to very much do it on their own, whereas other players in other sports or other esports may get a check to sent to them, right? You know, they may have sponsors, whatever. These guys all have to do it on either stream revenue, finding their own sponsors. Method is a little bit of a different boat just because of what SCO has done over there. But it's
look at the Overwatch League. Like they're guaranteed what, 50 grand and health insurance and all that crap.
Right, and that doesn't exist for the WoW players.
It doesn't exist. I mean, I guess it's on a smaller scale because you have a team of 5 or 6 maybe max
versus a team of like 25 or so.
25 where you would have to pay them all, and it's just so few players. I
Well,
think that
and
do
I
it.
have to take this conversation back to what started this whole conversation in terms of fanboy and stuff like that. And I will definitely agree with Gray on this front. 2 points here. The first point being that Exorsus, in terms of the guilds that have been in existence in the Mythic race for quite some time, Exorsus has historically been more willing to, I don't want to say push back against Blizzard, but been willing to communicate their disgruntledness nature with certain things that Blizzard does. You know, they're quick to point out, and they have no issues of pointing out things that Blizzard's wrong. One of the big conversations at that point was around when they got their ban in the TOV race. And I have to agree that I would definitely, if I was in their position, I would be more inclined to be like them in terms of, I have no problem pointing out Blizzard's faults. You know, I pay to play this game. Blizzard receives my money, and at some point there definitely needs to be a point where Blizzard recognizes that, you know, as being the person that provides a service, you have to provide that service and keep up a certain level of expectations to the people that are paying you to do such service. Second point being that, I just don't, I don't know. I kind of have to agree with things like that. And it just, things need to be better in terms of that front. You know, yeah.
And I mean, on that note, Exorsus actually have succeeded in the past in getting Blizzard to change, kind of change core game mechanics. Because if you remember, during Dragon Soul, their rogue got the world first legendary daggers because the server transferred their faction changed, which at that point used to reset your raid lockouts. And they just got an extra lockout worth of gear into that rogue to get him the legendary daggers, 1 week early. And there was a big drama from what I remember. Again, my memory might be wrong, but I remember that, at least I think I remember, there was a bit of drama about oh, that's cheating, that's not cheating, that's just Blizzard, how they designed it. But I'm pretty sure that even starting next year, if you server transfer, your lockout stayed the same and it didn't reset or faction change, whatever it was. So it's something to consider.
Yeah, I wonder if your bad luck protection resets if you server transfer.
There was a rumor going around that if you race change, your bad luck protection would reset in the 7.1 days. Granted,
fixed it.
There was a lot of things with bad luck.
To a monk.
There was a lot of things with bad luck protection that was very questionable. There was a whole box that if you got, the more legendaries you got, the higher your chance of getting it would get, which is why it's the beginning of expansion, especially during the first 2 weeks or something. Usually if one person got one legendary, they would get second one pretty soon, and then a third one, and so on and so on.
Well, yeah, we had someone like that.
Well, a lot of people were waiting on the first one. And then there was the exploits that if you go into Tempest Keep and you loot the legendaries from Keltus, those would count for your bad luck protection. So you could boost your RNG insanely. Then there was some other bugs that your bad luck protection was very much amplified in Court of Stars. That you've just spammed Court of Stars in the first 2 weeks, so you could just get legendaries popping 24/7.
Dang.
And
should have taken advantage of these.
Yeah, there were a lot of very small, hidden, not well-known exploits. Well, not even exploits. I don't know how to describe it better, but it also just seems very just problematic that Blizzard's that you have such huge systems that's obviously not being as well checked as possible.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and we could absolutely continue to talk about this type of discussion here, and we're already an hour and 40 in. So again, for those of you listening, this is we kind of like to throw something in a little bit of newsworthy, or things like this to kind of just give some tidbits of fun or just kind of overall discussion points that involve around the WoW raid scene. And so before we close out for the day, for those of you who might be interested in reading an article like this, it's a very good article, and like I said, it is done well enough that it actually has changed my opinion on Exorsus and what they do over there. But one of my favorite sections, it talks about different things, like I said, it talks about Tomb, the overall state of Tomb, difficulty between the different bosses. It talks about one point where you definitely see the number of pulls that required to kill a boss jump, almost exponentially from one boss to the next. And then at the end, there's some overall bigger picture that have problems that have existed since day one of Legion. It talks about like the issues with the lockout system, the Titan forging system, the legendary upgrade system, and what's wrong with that. And I happen to agree. It's yet another grindy point that doesn't need to be there. Again, what we talked about is different points in this discussion today on the podcast with tuning encounters for immunity classes or classes with soaking abilities. And then also their Blizzard's how they handle implementing balance changes. So again, it's a very good article. It's a very good read. I will definitely link it in the show notes. I know other people out in the creative community revolving around WoW have alluded to this in different respects. So check it out and all that kind of stuff. But before we close out today, I typically like to give us everybody on the show a point to kind of plug their social media or how people can find them. So before we leave today, Gray, is there any way our listeners, if they feel like they want to reach out to you about different things, that they can get a hold of you or find you?
Of course. I mean, I have a Twitter account that I usually try not to be too toxic on. I have a Twitch from which I stream my insane rogue gameplay, and I'm also various degrees of active depending on time of day and amount of work I do in multiple class discords, such as like Paladin Discord, Rogue Discord, Tank Chat Discord.
Yeah. What are the handles on your Twitch and your Twitter so people can find you there?
So on Twitch, I am just Gray_Hound for Twitch. On Twitter, I am bit_hound because somebody stole my original name. And then all the other Discords, I'm also Greyhound, which is pretty easy to find.
And I will absolutely include all the links to where you can find him at these various places in our show notes. But as per usual, Cole still does not have social media. He is our resident grump, so keep sending the emails our way. Dan, if you're awake, my man, let people know where they can find you.
I'm here. Before I do that, I just want to throw another piece of info out. While we were recording, I stumbled upon method.gg. There is a World 5th Style of War, which renamed themselves to JTH48. I don't know, but congrats to them getting KJ. It was literally about a half hour ago that Method GG posted it. Other than that, everyone can find me at JacksonGuide1125 on Twitch and Twitter.
Cool. And as for myself, as always, guys, you can find me over at the other podcast I do where we talk all things Blizzard in their gaming realm. Blizzard Umbrella, which our Twitter account is at Blizz Umbrella. You can find us over there, or our website, www.theblizzardumbrella.com. For myself personally, you can find me on Twitch and Twitter, both McIrish Gaming. And then here on this show, you can find us on Twitter, which is at @_TRC podcast. You can find us also at our email, where you guys can let us know what you think, what topics you want us to cover, say hello, or give us any praise, that kind of thing, which is at theraidersconfessional@gmail.com. There's no apostrophe on the S. So before we take off, though, Gray, big thank you from us. This has been a very good show.
Thank you.
And you have certainly brought a lot of insight to this discussion that we probably wouldn't possess otherwise. So thank you very much.
No problem.
Whoa, what are you trying to say?
Well, our DH hush cold plug your ears is kind of crappy. But no, that's going to do it for us, guys. So for myself, from Cole, from Dan, and from now Gray, we will talk to you in the next episode. See ya.
Thank you and happy rating.
Thank you.